One quick question, how does it feel to be part of one of the most revolutionary historical societies in America? No, I say that, it sounds glib, but I'm serious because I've been asking around and trying to figure out if what we are doing here is unique. Turns out it is, yeah. Our humanities-focused approach to tackling contemporary issues through conversation, dialogue, and perspective-taking is a new idea. It's even a bit of an experiment. But as we found out last year, it can be quite effective and meaningful. As Todd has already mentioned, we've done so much because of you, and I have to say thank you just for showing up and your enthusiasm and your support. We literally couldn't do it without you, so thank you. Behind the scenes, there's so many others to thank, from my board members who give tirelessly of their time and smarts to the women with me day in and day out. So I'd like to thank Rosemary, Irina, Lynn, Marianne. Your humor, your dedication, and your pep talks are invaluable. Here in Cambridge, we don't do history for history's sake. It isn't enough to present history as something that happened, some event. We need to dig deeper and answer the question, so what and who cares? Just as we did last year, we are asking another question relevant to our lives. We're asking, what does Cambridge make? You probably already know about our impressive manufacturing history: candy, bricks, soap, glass. It's a list we should be proud of and celebrate. But what have we made recently? What do we make now? How does what we make connect us to each other and our community? How are we as creative beings expressing ourselves through what we make? Last year, we talked about housing, an issue on everyone's mind because we all live in houses. This year is just as important because we all are or were workers. It's something we care about personally and as a country. So according to the City of Cambridge, there are around 116,000 people in our city's workforce. I'm one of them. This year's theme intrigues me because I'm fascinated by the decline of manufacturing in this country, the new creative economy, and the technological disruption of jobs that's been happening in our country for years. I'm curious about what it does to our built environment, our buildings and physical landscape, and how it changes the daily lives of people. Over the past couple of years, we've heard plenty from presidential candidates about economic development in this country. There have been declarations about reviving jobs in front of Detroit or Pittsburgh factories. A New York Times article last October asked, why are politicians so obsessed with manufacturing? And then after the election in November, the MIT Technology Review wrote, manufacturing jobs aren't coming back. President-elect Trump's promise to bring back production jobs ignores the realities of advanced manufacturing. This is a topic of pressing interest that we as a community should be talking about. And as we know, we can't have a conversation about what's happening in our worlds without asking, how did we get here? The Cambridge Historical Society helps you answer just that question. So thanks to you, last year we held a number of great programs that attracted the attention of you, our members, and also a lot of new people. I hope you'll show up just as enthusiastically this year as you did last year. Bring your friends or make new ones as we learn about Polaroid, how we make bread now, craftivism, drug research, brick making, and more. Not only are we dedicated to helping you understand your past, we do it in a fun and accessible way. We're proud of that. We're proud of our programs are attracting people of all ages and people who've lived in the city for years, as well as people who are brand new to the area. I'm just as eager as you are to hear from our speakers tonight, but in closing, I wanted to repeat two very important sentiments that I shared with you last fall at our final symposium. One, know that the Cambridge Historical Society is an organization that welcomes all people to its events and programs. Whether we are here at the library or at our headquarters at the Hooper Lee Nichols House on Brattle Street, we are a safe place for thoughtful, respectful dialogue. You are welcome here. Two, know that the Society remains committed to our work of highlighting the importance of history in our lives today. Now more than ever, we need to review what our city, our society has done. There's great uncertainty in our future, but great wisdom in our past. We promise to help you find it. And personally, I want to say thank you for making this society one of the best in the country. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Shaun Nichols to help us learn more about what Cambridge makes. Shaun is a college fellow and lecturer at Harvard in history at Harvard University. His research and teaching center on the history of capitalism, labor, and immigration in the modern United States and the world. His current book project, it's a bit of a mouthful, Crisis Capital, Industrial Massachusetts and the Making of Global Capitalism, recounts the industrialization and deindustrialization of Massachusetts as told through the global flows of migrant labor, and mobile capital over the last 200 years. Although Shaun's last name is Nichols and his wife's last name is Lee, we don't think they're related to the Hooper Lee Nichols house, but of course they are welcome there at any time. Shaun will be speaking first and will introduce our other speaker, Ed Childs, before their shared conversation. There's going to be a Q&A period at the end. We're not doing a microphone, but if you could just raise your hand, Shaun will call on you. Use your outside voice, not your library voice, and he's going to repeat the question. Please make sure to ask a question with a question mark at the end and not make a personal statement, and we will remind you of that if you get it incorrectly. But thank you so much for your support. I look forward to seeing you this year. You're always welcome in our offices. And ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Shaun Nichols.
I think so. Should be. Oh, yeah, that's good. Give him a PC. He's ready to go. Do you want this?
Yes, please.
Okay. Very good.
All right. I want to thank Marika and Lynn for hosting me, and I want to thank the entire Cambridge Historical Society for inviting me today. It's a real pleasure to get to talk to all of you. In preparing for this talk today, I was told that Cambridge audiences are broadly interested in the ways in which Cambridge fits kind of broader national and global trends. But at the end of the day, what you guys are really interested in is how Cambridge totally bucks those trends. It is completely different from everything else that's going on in the world. In this talk, we're going to get a little bit of both. In the beginning, we're going to see in many ways how Cambridge was quite similar to what was broadly happening in Massachusetts. And then we'll also get a taste of how by the end, Cambridge ended up looking a little bit different from the story we know so well. And invariably, this means talking about industrialization and deindustrialization, sort of perennial evil twin. And as Marika kind of hinted you in, I am very much a connoisseur of industrialization and deindustrialization. Of course, my own current manuscript project, Crisis Capital, is very much interested in this story. I've actually become increasingly convinced and increasingly interested in the ways in which the economic development of Massachusetts, rather than mirroring our kind of common story about the rise of industry in the 19th century and its collapse in the 20th century, we've heard that story over and over again, was actually in some ways structured by intermingling waves of industrialization and deindustrialization, often simultaneously, going back well into the 19th century. With this presentation, though, today, my goal is not going to be to convince you of that broader argument, although I'm going to certainly allude to it. Instead, I want to make a slightly stranger intervention. And that will be to convince you that industry, in some sense, is really quite weird. It's weird in a number of interesting ways. Now, this may not sound like a very appropriate or very sophisticated argument for a Harvard historian to offer you today, but I think it's an important one to make. We tend to think about industrialization as a sort of natural outgrowth of economic maturation, where it's an expected outcome, the kinds of entrepreneurial drive and mechanical know-how that were uniquely assembled here in Massachusetts. But I ultimately see it as a product of neither. Instead, I want to emphasize the ways in which industry emerged in Massachusetts and in Cambridge out of a sense of desperation and economic turmoil. I want to emphasize how industry was a sort of odd and ill-fitting phenomenon that was especially, at first, neither entirely welcomed nor celebrated in Massachusetts, and whose death was, in some ways, a long time coming. In other words, my hope is that by demystifying industrialization a little bit, you might be less surprised by the coming of its twin, by deindustrialization, and the creation of the so-called new economy in Cambridge and the rest of Massachusetts. So if I could sum up the beginnings of industry in Massachusetts in a few words, going back into the 1810s and the 1820s, those words would be labor and capital shortage. And that being the case, it might surprise you to learn that many of Massachusetts' earliest mills were, for all intents and purposes, business failures. America's first water-powered integrated spinning and weaving factory, the Boston Manufacturing Company of Waltham, Massachusetts, for instance, organized in 1813 by a group of wealthy Boston entrepreneurs. We often just refer to them as the Boston Associates today. It faced major obstacles, securing both its economic legitimacy and its workforce. Indeed, with labor and capital still pricey commodities in early 19th century Massachusetts, workers tied to productive agriculture, and capital bound to Boston's immense mercantile wealth, Massachusetts' economy was simply put too robust to allow for industrialization on a mass scale. Mill owners, for instance, could not afford to pay enough to retain a permanent workforce. They're instead stuck recruiting local farm girls on temporary contracts and paying them 80% over prevailing British pay scales. Making matters worse, most Boston capitalists were, at the end of the Civil War, largely abandoning these mills, poor path to profits, instead deciding to chase far more lucrative ventures in Western real estate and railroad construction. Thus, bereft of both labor and capital, these were terribly constrained enterprises. And as a result, by the end of the Civil War, the early Massachusetts textile industry in particular was actually on the verge of collapse. Many factories shut their doors, many had to totally retool operations. Many commentators worried that industry in Massachusetts was already bound for the history books. After the Civil War, however, Massachusetts' industrial fortunes began to turn. What changed? A few things. First, those railroads that Boston capitalists were now investing in, instead of local industry, were now bringing in wheat and meat in such prodigious volumes. They had essentially rendered New England agriculture uncompetitive, which helped push thousands of New England farmers off their land, including, of course, my great-great-great-grandfather, Andrew Jackson Nichols, born in 1840, a farm boy in Scituate, Massachusetts, who ended his life a shoemaker in New Bedford. But New England was just one destination for this wheat. Often arriving at Boston, these train cars of wheat often became boatloads of wheat to be shipped off to European ports. Portugal, Italy, Russia, Germany, Ireland, to name a few. This had two results. First, much as it had in New England, these literal boatloads of cheap American wheat quickly rendered these European peasant farms redundant. They simply could not produce wheat cheap enough to compete with American imports. Second, and perhaps most importantly, this export wheat trade raised an important issue. Namely, what did these European nations have to send back to America on these boats once the wheat was emptied out? Indeed, what did America want that a place like Portugal or rural Ireland could produce? On the face of it, not a whole lot. So steamship companies, ever savvy, realized that cheap freight was better than no freight at all, since they paid the same to send their boats back to Boston whether they were full or whether they were empty, began retrofitting their steerage holds for human transport, offering cut-rate tickets to potential migrants. So in a twisted and circular sort of way, American ships imported wheat, ruined European farmers, and then offered cheap steerage tickets for those ruined farmers to come to America. New England's perennial labor shortage, which has been such an issue for these early Boston capitalists, finally be solved on the backs of these immigrant laborers. And this may be a somewhat controversial view, but importantly, from my perspective, America's immigrants were not attracted to America by its thriving industry more than they were pushed out by America's thriving agriculture. And capitalists, following in the wings, were eager to capitalize on that. Finally, the overall shakiness in the Massachusetts economy after the Civil War made it in some ways ripe for industrial redevelopment. This is precisely why in Massachusetts, industry tended not to predominate in already developed economic centers, like Boston, where costs were high and mercantile pursuits still promised better capital returns, but most often in smaller, less economically secure places, like Chicopee or Pittsfield. Great example of this is the New Bedford Fall River area, where unemployment left in the wake of whaling's collapse was ultimately leveraged into a thriving textile industry. And another place we can see this process in play is right here in Cambridge, to which firms were attracted not by its consummate level of existing development, but by the opposite, by its relative lack of development, especially vis-a-vis Boston. Indeed, most early Cambridge industrial firms were actually Boston emigres, looking to take advantage of cheap marshland and water access, especially in East Cambridge and Cambridgeport. Indeed, East Cambridge's first factory was the Boston Porcelain and Glass Company, founded in 1813 as an offshoot of the existing Boston Crown Glass Company, South Boston. Eventually morphed into the New England Glass Company, which is pictured here as it was in 1855. The American Rubber Company, established in 1872 in Boston, had moved to Cambridge by the end of the decade. By 1896, it had 1,500 employees and a factory spread over 7 acres. The Simplex Wire and Cable Company, formed in Boston in 1842, produced fire screens, wire cloths, bird cages, ultimately electric cables. It moved to Franklin Street in Cambridge in 1885, and by 1930, it employed over 750 workers, expanded over many city blocks, as you can see pictured here. The John Squire Company, one of Cambridge's most famous plants, is originally located in the Faneuil Hall Marketplace, beginning in 1842 as sort of a local butcher shop. But of course, as it sought to expand into a full-on slaughterhouse and meat packer, it became clear that Faneuil Hall was sort of a limiting venue for those sorts of pursuits, and instead it bought a large tract of land along the former Millers River in East Cambridge. It's located now around where Star Market and the Twin Cities Plaza is. By the early 20th century, the factory's facilities had come to take over 20 acres of land. It was killing about 6,000 hogs a day. All of which were shipped, by the way, or as live hogs, from the Midwest on those same railroads our early Boston friends had built for us. Where meatpacking plants popped up, soap factories were soon to follow, looking to render excess pig fats into cleaning products. The Lever Brothers Company, for instance, was branched off into Cambridge by its English parent company in 1898. In other words, although we tend to talk about capital mobility, it's a uniquely 20th century affair in which American firms were, and still are, lured abroad by cheap labor, cheap land, state inducements. In many ways, in the 19th century, these same exact processes played out as well, just on a much more local level. Undeveloped Cambridge became a magnet for runaway Boston firms. Now, of course, I don't have the time to dive into the story of each and every Cambridge factory. There were so many of them. But suffice it to say, I think they share a couple of key attributes that are worth highlighting. First, they tended to be uniquely diverse. And this is one way in which Cambridge did look, indeed, quite different from many other Massachusetts cities, which tended to specialize in the mass production of a single commodity. Such diversity is reflected in the early 20th century recollection. Cambridge resident Samuel Eliot, son of the Harvard president, who remembered that, quote, "The chief Cambridge industries of my boyhood were books and printing, bricks, confectionery, soap, furniture, tinware, glassware, musical instruments, and metal goods." And to that could be added packed pork, hoses, electrical wire, a pretty large list for chief industries of a city. So why such industrial diversity? Brings us to the second factor that marked out Cambridge industry. Namely, that Cambridge was not so much an organic process of industrialization built to serve national markets. It was more of an ad hoc process of local small firms trapped to Cambridge's relative economic backwardness, coming in and setting up shops to serve the needs of Boston's mercantile economy. In other words, Cambridge industry is essentially the servant of an established trade economy in Boston, not some sort of organic process unto itself. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it's worth noting that generally speaking, these were not really great places to work. Some of Massachusetts' earliest mills had extremely long working hours. Hours of 4 a.m. to 7 p.m., 7:30 p.m., 6 days a week, very common in the early 19th century. By 1874, workers' strenuous political efforts resulted in a 60-hour law for women and minors. 10.5-hour weekdays and 7.5-hour Saturdays became standard schedule for area mills until the passage of 58-hour legislation in 1892. Not only were hours long, but jobs were often monotonous and dirty. Helen O'Brien Geiss, who worked at the Simplex factory, recalled in an interview in the 90s that, quote, women ran cotton-covered wires, which would go on a wheel. I'd run cotton wire through the dye. My job was so darn dirty with all the dust and dirt from the cotton, I'd get sneezing and coughing on it. When I first worked there, I only made $13 a week. She added it was nonetheless one of the better jobs for a girl. Women usually couldn't get the others. Stories from the John Squire slaughtering plant are even more stark. As Cambridge Chronicle colorfully described it in 1874, quote, thronged with grimy, coarse-looking men, from within which rise the bellowing and piercing cries of terror-stricken animals, where the floors are drenched and the walls splattered with blood, where greasy odors impregnate the air, and the horns, hides, bristles, hooves, and entrails of dead creatures are lying about. Yay! Indeed, for most workers, it was not until the industrial union movements, the 1930s and 1940s, these jobs seemed to present any positive attributes. Hester Hutchings, Canadian immigrant worker at Central Square's National Biscuit Company, for instance, told one interviewer that back in the 1920s, quote, it was really bad. We started at $11 a week for 48 hours. Then the union got going, we made $40 a week. We worked a lot of overtime, sometimes made $100 a week. The union did a lot for us. Even into the union era, as my broader research has shown, workers usually had very little good to say about their repetitive, dull factory jobs. But they usually did speak highly of as their decent pay, job security, benefits. That's what made industrial work worth it. This brings us to one other way in which Cambridge came to look quite different from the rest of Massachusetts, namely in the consequences of industrial decline to the city and its people. Fast forwarding to the 1970s and 1980s, as many of you here tonight know, many of Massachusetts' disadvantages again caught up with it. Amidst an energy crisis, energy was particularly costly here. Rapidly multinationalizing factories find it cheaper to produce abroad, taking advantage of undeveloped areas that had the same advantages Cambridge once had in the 19th century. And finally, the state of Massachusetts, which had traditionally backed industry through direct subsidies and tax abatements, changed tack. Began to pursue a very different economic strategy, one that directly benefited the city of Cambridge in a number of interesting ways, in hopes of creating more high-tech workers. For cities like New Bedford and Lawrence, this was not necessarily great news. Industry drained away with little else to replace it. Cambridge, however, yoked to its high-powered research universities, rapidly re-emerged as an economic powerhouse in the state of Massachusetts. In the decade following 1975, about 3/4 of new job creation in Massachusetts occurred solely in the Boston area. The old Boston Woven Hose and Rubber Company, the Lever Brothers soap factories, were demolished to make way for an extension to MIT's Draper Laboratories. The Daggett Candy Factory on Ames Street was acquired and redeveloped by MIT in 1961. The Brigham Ice Cream Factory became MIT's Center for Cancer Research in 1975. As Malcolm Fryer Jr., Executive Vice President of the Cambridge Chamber of Commerce, put it in 1973, quote, Cambridge for years has been a mecca for research and development firms. There are two very significant reasons why these firms have brought hundreds of creative people and their abilities and ideas to Cambridge. These reasons are Harvard University and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Without these two world-famous universities, Cambridge would be just another depressed former manufacturing city. In other words, thanks to its connection to its universities and their research output, Cambridge was in some sense beautifully situated to take advantage of the transformation into a high-tech, a two-tiered high-tech economy, with higher-paid technical and research workers and lower-paid service workers designed to serve that economy. Now, many historians tend to look upon this as something of a tragedy, the result of the scourges of deindustrialization. And yet, for me, while I agree that the so-called new economy is not necessarily living up to its potential, I want to finish by convincing you that deindustrialization is not in itself a problem. In fact, to me, deindustrialization becomes something of a mix between a smokescreen and a scapegoat, distracting us from the real issues at play. So if you take nothing else from this presentation, I hope it's the following. First, I think we need to stop romanticizing the industrial era. I think it's fine to remember it. I think it's fine to celebrate it. I think it's bad to romanticize it. It's ironic to me that a term like industrial revolution, which was actually coined in the 19th century as a critical term, a way to give a name to the force so many saw as polluting the waters and impoverishing the people of Britain, has now re-emerged as this kind of vague term aspiration. As we've seen, there was basically nothing that made industrial work inherently better, and actually a lot that made it inherently much, much worse. High wages and union stability did not spring magically from the factory floor, nor are these factories a sign of America or Cambridge's unflappable economic strength. So, why do we care so much about industry? I, for one, suspect that a nostalgia for industry is really a nostalgia for a bygone political economy, what we might call the New Deal order. It's a political economy structured by stable unions that won their members high wages, good benefits, alongside a federal government willing to provide decent retirements and back those unions during challenging times. Our celebration of this bygone era of American manufacturing hegemony, I suspect, has little to do with a time in which people had to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week in hot and humid mills in the early 19th century. I think it has more to do with the kind of stable, worker-centered political economy that emerged after 1932. Although I could be wrong. I'm not often, but I could be. To that end, I think we do well to stop focusing on somehow bringing industry back to America, and more how we can make the next generation of Cambridge industry, the so-called new economy of high-tech service, a fairer and more sustainable iteration of Cambridge's economy. And to that end, it gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce a real veteran of that struggle, someone who's been very much interested in doing just that in the city of Cambridge. Ed Childs will be joining me. He's going to talk for a little bit before, and we'll have a little conversation. Ed Childs is Chief Steward of United Here, Local 26 at Harvard University. He's also a national committee member of the Workers' World Party. He's been a cook at Harvard for 42 years. And among his many accomplishments, he was recently, of course, the leader of last October's strike at Harvard University, where 736 cooks, dishwashers, and dining hall workers won retroactive wage increases, amounting to $3 an hour, a 5-year contract, a first-time ever stipend during summer layoffs, better, less expensive health insurance, as well as a number of really big gains that actually exceeded their initial demands. So it gives me really great pleasure to introduce Ed to all of you today.
Go. All right, thank you, that was great. I don't know how much of we are. Now I want to take you a look inside of all the workforce that has been created and what we're doing and in relation to the Cambridge society, how we're making things happen in the development of society. So what you see here is one of our struggles that actually they made a movie out of it called Occupation, which I'll get into a little bit later. I want to start off with a struggle that I think was one of our most significant ones, which was when I started at Harvard. It was around the apartheid movement. That Harvard University was the last institution in this country to divest from apartheid, the South African regime, who had slave-like conditions in South Africa. Nelson Mandela was still in prison, and the struggle against the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa was very brutal. we got together, the dining hall workers got together with a coalition of students and other groups to take Harvard on. That, as you'll see in other things, is that we decided that, no. Harvard is not Harvard. Harvard is us. And that we have a say in our life, in what we produce. As Brother Shaun was showing, all those factories, those workers made those factories. There's a life there. So, during the apartheid movement, in the anti-apartheid movement here, like I said, we built a coalition. But we also did other things. We built demonstrations, we had building takeovers, but we decided to move beyond that. We became our own foreign policy development within Harvard University. Harvard had a relationship with the South African apartheid government. We wanted a relationship with the African National Congress and the Pan-African National Congress, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So, we called them up. That's all you had to do is call them up. And say, who are you? Well, we're the dishwashers and cooks at Harvard University. We'd like to get together with you. And we're also getting a coalition with student groups. They came and met with us. And we decided to form a coalition with the African National Congress in it. And we had a demonstration. There was one of the most significant demonstrations against apartheid in this country. There was 7,000 people came to it, and it was in Harvard Yard. I'll tell you a little intricacies that happened. I think only dining hall workers can do, which was, Harvard says you cannot have any ANC flags, which the United Nations had representatives of the ANC in the United Nations. So they had a legitimate flag that was flown in the United Nations. And when dignitaries come to Harvard, their flag is quite shown up at Harvard. It's put up at University Hall where John Harvard statue is. But they refused to put the ANC flag up. So, what do? Middle of the night, we get together with the clerical workers, and we get together with the custodians. Custodians can open windows. And the students made a flag. And we put a flag up. Well, in the morning, it was taken down. So, together with the students, we said, in our rally, we're going to have a flag, and it's going to be the biggest flag you've ever seen. And so, I don't know if you know Memorial Hall, the church, Memorial Church. Well, there's where the graduation is, the steps there, and there's big columns. Well, our flag that we made went from the top of the building and touched the bottom. Wow. It was just beautiful. But the significance of it was we created our own foreign policy for Harvard University. We met with the UN representatives of the African National Congress, and we had them come and speak at Harvard University. And not only that, another significant thing happened, which was that we don't have big technology back then, but we had telephones with cords. And so what we did is that the ANC got a call into Johannesburg in South Africa, into what was then the United Democratic Front, which was organized by the ANC, but it was a much broader coalition. It was the one with Bishop Tutu was in. And we talked to them and had them speak at the rally through the cord. But the significant thing was, the South African government had heard that this was going to happen. They had a relationship with Harvard University. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of their talk, gunfire happens. The place was raided. The person who was speaking was killed. The 7,000 people at the rally were infuriated. Harvard University, not immediately, but right after that, divested from South Africa. It was a policy that the dining hall workers and a coalition with the students created. So we make things happen. The workers make things happen. I'll show you one of our foreign policy things. Is this, I am actually representing the union in Cuba. It was an international labor conference, but we also wanted our own relationship with Cuba in the hotels in Cuba. We're the hotel restaurant workers and dining hall workers. We met with the hotel workers, union leaders and the workers. We met with the University of Havana dining hall workers. And they set up a meeting with Fidel Castro. It was our foreign relationship that we had started on our own. We also did this in France. We are doing it around the world, creating our own foreign policy. So one thing that came out of this struggle was that a lot of things that come out of it, better wages in our struggle, but also in that coalition, we were the first union, actually the first place in this side of Mississippi to have in our contract gay, lesbian, and transgender rights. And it came from that struggle. And that's us making things happen. So the next major thing that we did was, and you all probably remember this, is the living wage campaign. This actually is the picture of the living wage campaign, where in a coalition with the students took over the president's office for 3 weeks. And we organized the workers, both the dining hall workers and the custodial workers, to support them. We support them in different ways. One, at rallies like this. Other things like we supplied them food. Also, we did a lot of work. They had actually a city outside. And remember that, the city outside? It was they actually had their own postal code. It was so well organized. But what it did was it created a focus on the living wage in this country. There was other struggles around the country that had focused on the living wage. But taking over the president's office at Harvard, and then the workers all gelling on that, we actually called for a strike. If the living wage didn't go in, we called for a strike, and we rallied outside. So did the custodians. And Harvard gave in. They did a $10 living wage, which projected up to $20 today. Today, our workers, as you'll see later, our dining hall workers, dishwashers make $20 an hour with good benefits from these struggles. That's what it produced, but I think actually the biggest thing it produced was inspiration. We inspired workers around the country to do things. We inspired people around the world to do things. We inspired people in Cambridge to do things. I think that's the biggest contribution that we actually did. And bringing it up to today, you can see what brought up the strike at Harvard University. We had a very significant strike. A church meeting with community groups, unions, and others, around 70 people, and they were organizing a counter inauguration. And we went around identifying each other. And when I identified myself, I said, I'm here with some of the organizers. And they said, well, no, this guy is from Harvard University, he was just on strike. And they gave me a standing ovation. I realized that, yes, we did a national struggle. And I realized, because when I started, they wanted to talk. So when I started saying, I said the Harvard strike, and they said, no, you don't have to say Harvard strike. You just say the strike. Because that was the significance of it in this country, that everybody knew that we had gone on strike. Nobody in Boston really knew, unless you were part of Harvard, because Harvard was able to control the press. The Globe, the Herald, all the news, very little on the press. The Guardian newspaper in London had more stories about us than the Boston Globe. The San Francisco Chronicle, the LA Times, the New York Times, the New Orleans papers, all had much more stories on us than Boston. So the country was focusing on what we had done. We're mostly immigrants. We're 60% immigrants. Right, Sarah? Sarah's one of our leaders.
Yeah, I believe so, 60%.
Yeah.
And mostly female too.
We were getting calls from their relatives all over the world, from Greece, from South Africa, from Namibia, from Portugal, from Brazil, saying, what's going on? We see you're on this striking stuff that's going on. We made an impact in the world. We made an impact for at least two major reasons. There were other things that we got out of it, but it was that, one, we were taking on the big building. Harvard University, $40 billion endowment, the biggest name in the world. We were taking it on, and we were beating. The other thing was, which was actually more important, was we were taking on the issue of healthcare. Harvard was dismantling our healthcare. Our workers says, there's no way we're going to accept this. And that's what initiated the strike. Our workers pledged that they're not going home to their family without health care. And Harvard was dismantling our health care. It's a huge issue around this country, as we can see today, from the Trump administration trying to dismantle it, that it's a huge issue. And we took it on. So that's the whole big thing, that workers inside these factories that you've seen, inside these service things, we make things happen. We not only make your food, your clothing, and stuff, but we also make things happen around the world and here at home. So I think we'll continue as questions.
I think the plan is for us to answer audience questions, or are we?
Talk among the two of you.
Oh, the two of us. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things I found really striking about your presentation was the ways you sought to build alliances with different groups in Cambridge and different groups all over the world. And it's very interesting because I think today we tend to think about the union movement, in popular discourse, as actually quite insular, quite inward-looking. when in some ways, actually, the reality today is that it's branching out further than it probably ever has in the past. And so to that end, I wanted you to talk a little more about, why you see these alliances as so important, as well as how it fits into maybe your broader vision of the challenges presented by organizing service work, the ways in which organizing service workers is perhaps different from organizing industrial workers as was done in the past, and to just kind of give a vision of how you kind of see the union movement moving forward on issues.
It's an extremely important question for everybody, but particularly the union. Unions have only been successful when they've been in coalitions. When we were a much bigger part of the population, 45% of the population, unions only functioned in coalitions, in bonding with each other and coalitions with the community. If you see the civil rights movement, the king knew that he needed labor to really win. And if you watch the end of the civil rights movement, you'll see that the unions are in the forefront of the movement, that the king put them there. The unions also knew that for them to expand, because they were being beaten back at the time, they needed a coalition, and they accepted the coalition with King. A lot of us believe that that's one reason he was assassinated at that time. He did other things like bringing the war, but the minute he brought in labor and organized, he organized the union himself, which was the sanitation workers himself. That's when they assassinated. So that's going over the line. Because the potential that we have in a coalition. When we did stop the coalition. We stopped the coalition drives for a number of reasons. One, a lot of our leaders were arrested. People forget that McCarthyite period, Palmer raids, most of the leaders of the union movement were all arrested. Hoffman was arrested. Everybody was arrested. It was a Red Scare. You were comments, you were put it. You know who was arrested? Lucille Ball. People don't know that. She was the head of her union at the time. Well, she wasn't the head, she was one of the leaders, though. They put her in jail. That's how far they went. We hear about the Hollywood people, but it's the trade unions were really what they went after. And we were not allowed, those leaders were not allowed back in. A lot of leaders that were installed by the government were mafioso, who had no concept of coalition. Actually, a lot of them did want to build the union because if they were going to steal money, they'd like to steal something big, small. But they had no concept of coalition, which was how to build a union. And it's something the union movement is trying to realize today, especially around Trump. Trump is understanding that you divide the unions, you don't allow them in coalitions, you win, they lose.
So I do have a follow-up question on that, though, because one of the themes of our discussion today, and certainly my talks, was the ways in which Cambridge does reflect kind of broader trends in the nation and the world. But of course, Cambridge is quite different. And teaching at Harvard University, one of the things I was very much aware of was that one of the reasons the dining hall strike was so successful is because you had the backing of students and backing of many of the faculty members. And of course, that is going to get Harvard to listen. You had the backing of the larger Cambridge community. And I think it's fair to say that Cambridge is a fairly liberal, fairly progressive place in the nation. So what kind of advice would you have for union leaders who are coming from places that are not so much like Cambridge, where it's much more conservative areas, much more right-leaning existing political infrastructure, where maybe this coalition building isn't quite so possible? What kind of advice would you have in those kind of scenarios outside of Cambridge?
Well, the thing is that coalitions are hard to build. Yes, Cambridge has a liberal reputation, but I'll tell you, for our strike, it took a year and a half to build, to get that coalition. It wasn't like, oh, we're in Cambridge and it's all done. It took a year and a half to build, and a lot of it was built while we were on strike. And you are not going to be successful, especially today in this country, if you do not have a coalition. And it's a broad coalition. Doesn't mean, and when someone comes into the coalition, they bring themselves, whatever group they are, they bring their story, and you have to, wherever your mind is, you have to understand that their struggle is legitimate and that you're joining together to survive. My actually best understanding of this was in the South. I've been trying to go down the South and organize. So I was down in North Carolina, actually at the last inauguration, the one before this. And we actually had a demonstration against the Democratic National Convention because they were in North Carolina. And they had pledged that they would never go to North Carolina because it's a right to work city. And the workers down there called us. And they refused to go to the convention. And we had a demonstration of 3,000 people that day, which is the biggest demonstration in North Carolina since King's Day, because the repression is so high. And one thing I was amazed at, the first coalition meeting that happened, absolutely everybody was there. You had all the environmental groups, you had the NAACP, you had all the whole political spectrum. And I says, wow, this is amazing. In the North, we can't get this. He says, in the South, we understand that if we do not get together, you will be smashed. You will not just not succeed, you will be smashed. And so every group got together, the most radical black organization and the most conservative ecologists got together. It's an understanding we have to have throughout this nation.
I want to ask you one other question that's sort of related to that, and also related to kind of how we think about the new economy today. So at Harvard University, I'm teaching the history of American capitalism for a number of years. And one of the things we do in that course is at the end we have we have 2 days in the week where so we meet on Tuesday, and we have someone from the business community come in and speak to the students about what it's like to run a business today in the current global economy. And then on Thursday, we have 2 representatives of the local union movement come in and speak to them about what it's like to work today and run the modern labor movement in the global economy. And students often have very different reactions to these different groups. And generally, students aren't super hostile, but there was one particular year where there was one young man who was quite upset with the union presenters. And I'll never forget, he got up and he asked this question. He said, "Look, I work at this high-powered investment bank. I work 80 hours a week. I never get any time off. I'm constantly running around and moving around." And he's like, "Can you come in and you say that hotel workers should get to work 40 hours a week?" He's like, "That's crazy. When's it going to stop? Right? This is absolute insanity. Why do you get 40 hours a week and I don't?" And of course, to me, it was very striking because to him, of course, the idea was, the union would never help him, right? My reaction was, well, you should join a union, right? Like, you should also get to work 40 hours a week and get time to see your family and all the things you want, right? If your job isn't serving you, you should too. But to him, it was just absolutely crazy that as an investment banker, he would join the union. And obviously, I think if we think about Cambridge's economy today, right, I sort of mentioned that we have in some ways kind of this two-tiered economy where we have, in a place like around MIT, we have, very highly skilled workers and kind of janitors in New England. Of course, janitors now increasingly priced out in that area. Why do you think there is such a weird kind of disconnect between the union movement today and many highly paid technical workers? Why is organizing white-collar workers pose such a challenge? Why is that kid getting up in my class and saying, "This is totally crazy"?
Education. Educational system in this country. That's including the TV and the newspapers. You go to another country where those people actually organize into the unions. I went to Cuba. 80% of the workforce is unionized. I went to Iraq. 80% of that workforce is organized. I went to England. They're all organized. I went to Ireland. They're all organized. My relatives in Ireland, they're all organized. But I was visiting my cousins in Ireland, Galway, and I said, when I went to the house, they were away. They were at a rally in downtown Galway. The rally was because the healthcare system was going to up the fees. I said, wow. And there was 10,000 people in Galway. Galway was a fairly small city. He says, wow, it must up to the mark. I said, they sure did. You know what they did? They demanded, only with this one demand, that open heart surgery was going to cost 10 pounds from zero. And they understood that you don't allow anything. Your rights is that you have a right to health care. And they fought. That's their education system. That's the level of consciousness that they have. The level of consciousness in this country is way down. It's not just the banking. It's people in our industry. I said, our dishwasher make $20 an hour. You can go to another place where the workers are making $11 an hour, because it's the minimum wage here, but working twice as hard, no benefits, and not understand why you need a union. It's their high school education. It's reading the newspapers. It's controlled education. And like I said before, when our leaders were making the unions here, they were put under arrest. You know, so it's repression and repression in education. You know.
Should we open up the conversation? Okay, yeah, Lynn is standing up, so I've got to listen to Lynn. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So, two questions. One is, thank you both. Thanks for inviting Ed to be part of this. First question is a technical question. Sort of, something struck me about the graph of wheat exports, where wheat exports jumped, which looks to have failed by a relatively small margin, but of course that remains. It's being contested with the NLRB, but if you have any comment about that, those people, some of them feel they're workers too. But the larger question for me is, in this new economy here in Cambridge with biotech, you know, this sort of research people and service economy, what do you see, what do each of you see as the way, the pathways for people who aren't going to get PhDs at MIT into opportunity in Cambridge, where there may not be a strong union necessarily? You know, it's not a job at one of the big institutions like Harvard or MIT. So, you know, what are the pathways for people to have a fair treatment in this economy?
So thank you so much for your question. I especially appreciate it because I didn't think the opening question would be about wheat. That was kind of what came up. So the first question was about why is it that wheat exports go up during the Civil War? And I am not a specialist in wheat by any means, but my guess is that it has a lot to do with Republicans. So before the Civil War, of course, we have a kind of traditional struggle between Democrats and Whigs. Democrats are kind of free traders. They support slavery. They support slave cotton. And the Whigs support kind of national development in industry and independent farming. And the Whigs, of course, eventually collapse into the Republican Party. And once the South leaves, the Republicans are firmly in control. And one of the things the Republicans start doing is incentivizing railroad construction and really subsidizing railroad construction, which pushes out farmers into the Midwest. And that's when we start really getting that wheat economy going. It's a big part of kind of Republican political economy. So that's the answer to the technical wheat question, I think. Your second question, wait, remind me your second question
Well,
again?
graduate students.
Graduate students, okay, great. So I can speak with this from some experience, and, you know, on one hand, the answer is, I honestly don't know. I myself was very surprised by it, but I do think, look, you know, I asked Ed about why it is that he thinks highly skilled workers have such an aversion to unionization. And one of the answers historians often give to this question is that the United States welfare state ended up looking, for a variety of reasons, very different from European welfare states, right? So European welfare states developed what we call kind of a universalist approach to dispensing the benefits, where everyone, whether you were middle class, working class, or even elite, benefited in some ways from the welfare state. Everyone could get a pension. Everyone would get the universal health care. Everyone would get these different benefits. The United States kind of created what historians sometimes call a two-track welfare state, where for middle class and upper class people, the kind of welfare you receive is kind of structured into the tax code, right? So you don't just get paid to have children, you get a tax break, right? You get, you know, the roads just get constructed. You know, the income credits you get just kind of come in on your tax breaks and your tax returns. Which is very interesting, right? Because you're not getting something from the government. The government is just taking less of your own money. You have a very different kind of epistemological attitude towards that sort of thing. Whereas for those who are poor, you end up on the dole. You get a very different, much more visible kind of government aid. And many historians argue this is precisely how you get middle-class people in the United States saying, well, the welfare state doesn't really do anything for me, even though they probably bought their house with, you know, Federal Housing Administration assistance, and they probably get tax breaks for all their children. And it kind of created this sense where only poor people, you know, benefit from this welfare state, so why should I fund it? I think, you know, in some ways, I think that may partly be responsible for what happened to the grad student union movement, because there are so many grad students who feel, look, Harvard takes good care of me, Harvard pays me really well, Harvard does all these things I need, and it was, you know, for them, they thought, you know, I don't need a union, I'm fine, I'm totally well off. And of course, for every one of those, there were many grad students who have children or have unique medical needs that Harvard wasn't fulfilling so well, and they, you know, they didn't feel so well served by the system. But I mean, this is precisely why coalitions are so important, why these solidarities are so important, because it's very easy to fall into your own little bubble and think everything's fine and I'm fine. I don't need any help by anyone else. I think I'll let you take the third question, which was about, would you remind me, about basically what kind of opportunities can we find in the new economy? You know, how do we, you know, what sort of, what advice do you have to someone starting off in the Cambridge new economy?
Well, not very good. Professor Larry Katz at Harvard, we work with him, he's one of the economists over there, put a thing out, a paper out, and it was put in the Globe's, I think the Times did it too, in the business section, that the economy really hasn't grown any new jobs. And his definition of jobs was 40 hours with benefits. Over the last 10, almost 20 years, it has no projection to grow any jobs, not one job. There's people left and replaced. But the number of jobs that are real jobs, 40 hours with benefits, has not gone up at all. And that's what everybody's faced with, no matter if you're North Carolina or in Cambridge, Mass. The jobs that you're going to be getting are service jobs that they're trying to make, you can call part-time, is the gig economy, whatever.
Contingent.
And that's what you're looking for. Now, how's that going to change? With a lot of it means that we have to not only struggle about our place of work and the conditions that we're going to get, whether it's wages and stuff like that, but we have to change the way Wall Street is dictating how our work is divvied out. And that's gonna be a big hard struggle. It ain't gonna be done without a coalition and a lot of hard work. And actually, I'm optimistic about it. I see that we have a new administration in Washington that has come in and tried to throw fear into everybody. And what I've seen is people aren't so much afraid, but fighting back. I'll tell you, there was two things that impressed me at the inauguration here in Boston. Obviously, the 150,000 people who were at the Women's March. Huge, huge. I was at the last big one in the anti-war demonstration. It was actually my first demonstration I ever was in as a youth. And it was a little over 100,000 people. That was the moratorium against the wall. And this one, yes, it did. It outnumbered it. It was great. But I think there was one more demonstration that happened on the 20th, the inauguration day, which was, I think, more significant. And that was from my union. That was the Northeastern workers walked off the job. Solely for one demand, and to protest Trump. That was bold. And a coalition with the students. The administration backed down from doing any punishment against those workers who walked off the job in the middle of the day and marched to downtown. That's a lot of people put that out to prerequisite of a general strike in this country. It's doable. You add the Women's March with the dining hall workers in Northeastern, what they did, you add them together, you got a general strike in this country. And that can have a lot of potential where we want to go.
Do you have any other questions? Yeah.
Well, actually, Ed, that was just what I was going to ask you, is are we going to have a general strike? So, but you already answered that. So, so Sean, are robots going to take our jobs?
It's a great question, and it's such a controversial one because there's essentially two different ways of looking at it. One is, of course, robots are a direct replacement for human labor, and you know, we should be very afraid robots are going to take our jobs. The other one is, of course, that robots, of course, or automation, I should say, introduces new opportunities for humans, and we have to work alongside those. And there is some evidence to suggest, even in the late 19th century, which was, of course, a moment of massive technological change, that it did not necessarily displace forms of human labor as much as it created new ones, because people have to now fix these machines and tend to keep them up. One thing I would like to say, though, is I don't want to take necessarily a side on this debate, but I will say, there is something I think that's a little bit reactionary and a little bit knee-jerk about this. Robots are going to take our jobs, sort of thing. I remember early on when I was an undergraduate, I was doing this research on the Washington State labor movement in the 1920s, and I came across a series of resolutions passed by the Seattle Central Labor Council, which was one of the most left-leaning labor councils in the United States, and they resolved repeatedly against recorded music. We, the Seattle Central Labor Council, hate recorded music. We resolve against it. We urge our members to avoid recorded music, etc., etc., etc. Why? Because musicians formed a big part of the Seattle Central Labor Council. Of course, recorded music was a huge threat to the music industry. And of course, it is true that, believe it or not, being a musician used to be a respectable job in the United States in the 19th century. You could actually make a living wage as a musician, and of course it has been displaced by the recording industry. But very few of us probably would want to turn back the clock to the age before recorded music and go back to that. So I think we need to instead of saying robots are going to take our jobs, think more creatively about the ways in which we can reconfigure our economy, and so in such a way that robots actually promote human welfare and aren't competing against us. So we need to find a way to make it so we're not set in this kind of deadly, deathless competition with automation that can actually truly help us and make our lives better, because that's what it should be doing. I don't know if you have anything you want to add on the automation issue.
Yeah, we gotta develop robots how to